Hail! Matt Easton here. So this is partially a response video to ThegnThrand over at ThegnThrand channel. Link below to the video that this is a response to, but it's also an opportunity for me to talk about axes and swords again, particularly in the Viking era, but you could apply this to any period. So first up, ThegnThrand's challenge is to chop through a water bottle. So he did my challenges 1 and 2. Against the challenge 2 cutting challenge, which was cutting through as many cuts as you could put through one plastic milk jug as possible, and I think he did about the same as me. I think he did 6 cuts, which seems to be quite common actually across the board. But he did a response to that, setting me a challenge to cut through a water bottle with an axe. Now I'll talk about that in a second. But first up, I'd like to just say, obviously I've done videos in the past comparing axes and swords, particularly in the Viking, Frankish, Anglo-Saxon era, so the so-called Dark Ages. When we're talking about an axe versus a sword, you have to remember that primarily these are being used with a shield. So some of the comparisons between an axe and a sword aren't necessarily fair or even relevant when you bring a shield into the equation. One of those things, quite simply, is a sword is a longer reaching, a more nimble weapon, but both of those things to some extent become nullified with a shield, because once you've got a shield, that is your primary defensive object. And also shield fighting comes in very, very close, so the longer reach isn't always necessarily a big advantage. We can touch on the topic there of, for example, the Roman scutum and gladius. When you've got a very large shield like a Roman scutum, then the gladius is a perfectly adequate sword for the purposes, because they come very, very close to the opponents. So shields do change everything for those 2 main reasons. One, because they bring the fight closer, and also they provide the primary defense. And then third point that we should throw in as well is these nullify spears. So I have done a lot of videos talking about the superiority of the spear compared to the sword, and I'm usually talking about single weapons. So if one person has only a spear and the other person has only a sword. However, as soon as you bring shields into the equation, and let's face it, for most of history, the centuries when swords and shields were used, the shield was you know, ever present. So if the shield nullifies the spear to some extent, then very clearly swords become, relatively speaking, more useful. Again, for the reasons stated before, that the fight comes closer. Having a shield in front of you and able to engage the opponent's weapon while you've still got your attacking weapon ready enables you to nullify the spear. And there are more technical aspects as well. It becomes easier to actually cross the spear and keep control of the spear when you've got 2 objects such as sword and buckler, rather than simply having one object that's trying to take care of that spear, which is constantly disengaging and coming high, low, left, right, whatever. So let's get back to the main topic of the video. So when we're comparing a sword with an axe, I'll put the sword down now, very important thing to remember is that if shields are in the equation, then some of the relative differences between the sword and the axe become lesser. Okay, so I've talked about some of the advantages of the axe in the past. Before I go into the actual cutting here and the main challenge, I want to talk about a disadvantage of the axe, and that's the main topic of this video, and one of the reasons why this challenge is hard. So I'll just dispense with the shield for a second. So these 2 weapons, they can both kill people, they can both defend you, they can both be used with a shield, they can both be used in a shield wall, in mass melee, or they can be used in individual combat. Fundamentally, they are both kind of sidearms, but they do have some different qualities. The sword is generally longer, certainly this one is, and in the Viking era, generally speaking, most swords are longer than most one-handed axes. I'll talk about 2-handed axes in a minute. But there's one advantage that I want to focus on of the sword that pertains exactly to this challenge, and that is that you have an awful lot of edge to be able to apply to a target. So if my target is here, I can apply almost all of this edge, everywhere from near to the tip all the way down to about there, and it will still cut through the target. The axe, in comparison, has, you can see how much edge it's got, a few inches. Okay, I think that's maybe about 5 inches, which is a tiny portion of the edge compared to the sword. Now, when you're actually fighting and you're moving around, your opponent's moving around, and the distance is changing all the time, so you can't always dictate where you hit the opponent. Now, people's bodies are fairly big, their heads are not so big, but their arms and legs are much narrower. If we're aiming at something that is the diameter of a bottle, for example, which is roughly equivalent to an arm or a leg, then actually chopping through that with an axe is quite a difficult proposition, especially a small hatchet or tomahawk size axe like this. Whereas with a sword, it's relatively easy. That's the first thing. So the first thing is you've got a lot more edge to play with, so your distance is much less sensitive. You can hit someone anywhere with this edge and it will cleave into them. With the axe, very often you'll only hit with a portion of the edge, and this is what ThegnThrand's challenge is based on. The fact is that it's quite difficult to cut through a bottle that is only the same size as the edge, because if you get it slightly high or slightly low, you're only going to go through half the bottle and you're not going to fully bisect it. And that's true of any target you're hitting, could be an arm or a leg or a head. Okay, so it's relatively speaking more difficult to lay your edge on the target when you're using an axe. That being said, we know the axes do have some advantages against shields. They're more likely to damage shields. You can hook with them. They have more impact force because the mass, whilst it's being the same or even a bit lighter than a sword, the mass is all at the end, so they have a mace-like quality to them and they hit with a lot of force. If you're hitting someone wearing mail armour or even hitting someone's helmet, you're going to do more damage with this than you will do with this, because the sword is balanced towards the hand, the axe is balanced far away from the hand, towards the head. So in terms of inertia, the axe is an impact weapon and an edged weapon, whereas really a sword isn't a very good impact weapon at all. It's roughly equivalent to a stick, in fact, but with a sharp edge. So really this is a cutting weapon. This is an impact and cutting weapon. So these do have some advantages, but they also have a big disadvantage. Now, let's have a little look at the actual cutting itself. Now, first thing I would say to ThegnThrand is, your lovely replica that's like Ragnar Lothbrok's axe from the series Vikings, that's a bearded axe, I believe, and that has a fairly long edge on it, longer than this one here. So I'm making the challenge harder for myself by using what's essentially a tomahawk. Okay, this is the Condor, I think it's Viking hawk or something like that. I've modified it slightly, I've reground the edge. It's not super sharp, I have to say, but I've reground the edge to make it a bit better. This actually chopped down a tree last week, so I needed to redo the edge, and this is really a tree cutting edge geometry. This is not really a bottle cutting edge geometry. It is easier to cut bottles with something that is light, thin and fast moving. This is neither light, thin nor fast moving relative to its size. It's heavy for its size, the mass is at the end of the blade, therefore it accelerates slowly and it doesn't have great edge geometry. Another important difference between the sword and the axe is that the sword is thin, so it will pass through a target like a bottle. The axe has a great big socket in the middle, and ThegnThrand points this out in his video, that because of that socket you're very unlikely to leave a bottle standing, because as it goes through the bottle you might cut perfectly through the bottle, but then what's left of the bottle will hit that socket at the back and it will knock it flying. So I've chosen a fairly small blade. Some people I'm sure will say, Matt, why don't you use your Dane axe? Well, that would be cheating, wouldn't it? It'd be like, hey, you call that an axe? This is an axe. This kind of makes it too easy, and we know this can blast through water bottles. And one of the great things with the Dane axe is, as I've spoken about in previous videos, you make the blade very thin and you expand for the given amount of mass. You expand about 1 kilogram, you expand the amount of edge available to you. And the advantage to that is you've now got maybe 6 or 7 inches of blade, or even more, even up to maybe 12 inches on really large examples of blade to hit someone with, instead of the small 4 or 5 inches of something like a tomahawk. Obviously a bearded axe like ThegnThrand's Ragnar axe is a similar way of trying to solve that problem, trying to give you more available edge like a sword, but without increasing the mass. So in that case they extend the beard down, and that gives you more edge to play with. And this is a real tactical advantage, because whilst you're making a thinner and potentially less durable edge, if you're bashing it into armour and helmets and shields and things like this, you're increasing the available cutting edge you've got to play with, which is really what a Dane axe is all about, added to extra reach, which gives you greater acceleration. One thing I would say is if we compare like with like, the comparison for the Dane axe wouldn't be the one-handed sword. We'd really have to compare this with a two-handed sword, something like a Montante or Zweihander, and they have an immense amount more available edge to them. So if you're fighting in a melee and twirling this thing around and hitting opponents, you're far more likely to either miss with the end or hit them with the shaft than if you're using a Montante or a Zweihander, because you've got a lot of edge to play with there and you're more likely to hit and wound opponents than you are with the Dane axe. So yes, this has more edge than other axes, and yes, this has an enormous amount of cleaving power if you do hit with the edge, and yes, you have reach and impact power as well with this, the weight being at the end, but you don't have a lot of edge to play with. So a disadvantage with the Dane axe and all axes is you don't have a lot of edge relative to the length of your weapon. So, full disclosure, I'm going to start off with the easiest target, that is the small size milk jug. The plastic of these is the easiest to cut through, and this is the smaller size. Why am I doing that? Because I think I stand the biggest chance of success at this. If you look at the edge of my axe blade, clearly I can't cut a bottle which is wider than the length of my axe blade, because I'm not going to cut all the way through it, and that would fail Thrand's challenge. So this bottle, as you can see, is very slightly smaller, leaving me a couple of inches to play with than my axe blade. So let's see if I can do this one first. So the challenge is to get a clean cut through here without leaving plastic on either side. So that was a almost success. It tore one side of the bottle. You can see that here, so I won't count that as a clean cut. Let's have another go with another one. This is the bigger bottle, incidentally, because that's what I have. I haven't got any room to mess up now. Hurrah! So that was interesting. So that was a clean cut and I left it standing. The trick to that, one of the big differences is, ironically, I've got a bigger bottle, so I have less margin for error, but because it's a bigger bottle, it contains more water, it's heavier, it's more likely to stay standing. So I grab the back end, you can see it's a clean cut. There's a little bit of maybe scooping or tearing at the back, but it's basically a clean cut. And bottle left standing. So I think I kind of managed that. Let's try with a tougher bottle now. Let's try with a Pepsi Max bottle, one of my favourites. For a bit of fun, let's do it while holding the shield as well. Let's see if I can make that. I got a bit wet there. So to show you what happened to the bottle, so I got most of the way through it here, but my blade just wasn't deep enough and it tore the back end off. What's interesting is that tearing, funnily enough, that rarely happens with swords because you've got more edge, so the edge passes through the whole thing, but that is kind of indicative of the amount of momentum in an axe. Once you've accelerated it, it's just going through, it's going to hit that thing. So there's a lot of energy in the tip of an axe. Even if it doesn't cut, it still hits with a fair amount of force. And of course that's important if you're fighting against people in armour, mail armour, whatever, padding, or hitting someone on the helmet, that kind of thing, because it transfers a lot more energy to the target than a sword would. Just to point out that I'm really struggling with this particular tomahawk against Coke bottle, because as you can see, the blade is only slightly longer or wider than the bottle is, but of course when you're striking, you're hitting it at a oblique angle. So it's very, very difficult. You need to strike completely perpendicular, and then of course it's harder to cut. Let's have another go with another Coke bottle. Rubbish. So I didn't go all the way through. It went cleanly through what it did go through, but it only went through half of the bottle, as you can see there. So it's kind of a clean cut for maybe a third or a half of the bottle, and then tore the rest. Right, so I'm going to quit there with the small tomahawk, because obviously the length of blade I've got there, I can only do certain bottles. I'm going to finish off on a Fanta bottle with the Dane axe, just to remind you that it's a lot easier if you've got a lot more edge on your axe. That's how you do it when you've got more edge and more leverage. And so a combination of having a shorter shaft, so less acceleration at the tip, as well as having a shorter blade length, and bearing in mind that your blade doesn't hit at 90 degrees to the bottle. Usually there's a slight angle on it, so you're actually reducing the blade length there as well. But if you've got more blade length and more leverage, it's a lot easier. If you've got a sword, it's a lot easier. And even within types of sword, as we talked about in the past, certain types of targets are easier or harder with different types of sword. Something like a falchion, for example, very effective at chopping meat, chopping a cow in half, chopping a person in half, even chopping wood, more effective than most types of sword, but actually not super effective on plastic bottles, because plastic bottles require a very fast and thin, fast accelerating blade. So actually kind of cleaving power is not so important with plastic bottles, it's more about tip speed really. And so sometimes swords which you might perceive as being less cutting swords, something like a rapier, can do excellently against a thin tatami mat or a plastic bottle, because it accelerates very quickly. It's got a point of balance close to the hand, it's got a long blade, and it's narrow and obviously sharp. So that will actually bisect plastic bottles very effectively. So a good challenge, if you've got an axe, there's a lockdown challenge for you. Go and sharpen it up and have some fun cutting some water bottles before you throw them in the recycling. Thanks for watching. Thanks to ThegnThrand for making the challenge. Go and give it a go. Go and give his video a watch and his channel a subscribe and a like. Give my channel a like and a subscribe. See you really soon for more chats about axes, swords and everything like that you guys like. Cheers for watching. See you guys. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks.